I want to go to something the governor said just a couple of days ago, and then I want to come back and kind of press back just a little bit based on what Cindy said and what Dr. Chris has said. This is Missouri Governor Jay Nixon, I believe just 2 days ago, when asked his thoughts on what we just experienced.
Some weather events are so dramatic, and there's so much water in a concentrated area that you're just going to have to deal with an emergency. And so that what happened on the Merrimack doesn't have a lot, in these areas here, doesn't have a lot to do with dikes or dams in South Dakota or how the Mississippi River is managed. It happened because a unique weather pattern dropped over 10 inches of rain in a short period of time in hill country with thin soil. And when that happens, you're going to have floods, and there's not a lot you can do about that.
Channel Dr. Chris for me. What would, is that how he would see this?
The governor, unfortunately, is doing what politicians like to do as it relates to river policy, and that's push the buck off. Well, it's not anything we did. It's not anything anybody can fix. It's just a big bad rain. But it's more than that. It's what we're all talking about here to some degree is how everything is connected. So while this flood was primarily Merrimack in terms of the areas that were hit worse than, say, 93, part of that was because the Mississippi wasn't performing like a big river normally does and causing water to have to back up a little bit in the Merrimack. That's part of the connection there. Part of the lack of vegetation has to do with development patterns and whether or not what's going on in Pacific or Eureka or Arnold is being considered in one municipality without consideration for what's going to happen downriver or upriver. It's the idea that all of these things plus climate change fit together. They all mean something. And so I think to say offhand that this was just a big rain event and we don't have to worry about anything is the exact wrong message. The proper message is this was a big rain event. And Russell's right, you know, the Merrimack sometimes floods in the winter, so we have to be more prepared for that. But lots of different things happened, and we have to continue to study the relationship between those things so that we can make better decisions about where we put things so that flooding like this doesn't continue to cause billions and billions of dollars worth of damage. Because at some point we have to pay for that.
You seem to be agreeing with what the governor was saying.
More or less. I mean, what Governor Nixon said in terms of the Merrimack Basin was spot on. I mean, we got a record flood because we had a record rainfall event. The Merrimack River has never seen, in the period of record of these gauges, which goes back about 100 or so years in most of these gauges' history, a 7 to 11 inch basin-wide rainfall event at the same time over a 3-day period. That's what happened. You get a record flood. Can it be worse? Yeah, actually it could have been worse if we had had heavier rain in the upper part of the Merrimack Basin and perhaps heavier rain in the Big River Basin as well. So I mean, there are higher scenarios out there, but it probably would be a much lower probability because all that has to come together.
So are you saying there is no man-made effect?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying for the Merrimack Basin, there's very little man-made effect because the Merrimack Basin is pretty much in its natural state. Now, I'm not discounting anything as far as climate change or things that have been progressing across the Midwest over the last 20 or so years. I think we've seen a higher frequency of high-end events throughout the Midwest than we saw perhaps back when I was a kid. But that's just kind of a rough guess there. But to say it's man-made in the Merrimack Basin, I think is a little bit wrong.
Are we having an impact? Is our development having an impact?
Absolutely. Land use changes definitely impact the amount of runoff. I mean, if you have a bare soil or vegetation, it clearly absorbs moisture. If you put development in there, you're going to get direct runoff. You're going to have concrete that runs off into the rivers very quickly. So, I mean, since 1982, I mean, you can just imagine how much development has happened in local communities throughout the entire Merrimack Basin. That has a direct effect on, how much runoff goes into the basin. So I think we're seeing that effect, but to be able to pinpoint one thing, I think is oversimplifying something that's very complex. be able to say that it's just levees or just urban development or that it's climate change is, like I said, oversimplifying a very complicated Mother Nature.
So if it's complex, is there any agency, is there any individual that's looking at this from the big picture and saying this should be our plan? We have what is it, the regional sustainability of 1STL? I mean, is there a plan? Is the Corps talking to the towns on the river? Are towns on the river, do they have the ear of decision makers? Do you worry that there's a larger plan or lack of a plan that may be having an impact on you negatively?
Yeah, to some degree, we work with the Corps and DNR. Of course, they regulate a lot of the construction that's in the floodplain and near the floodplain and grading all over. So we're working with them. We'd like to work with them more in the future as we see what's going on here and try to get a better idea of what we can do to lessen the impact. Of course, we don't want to see levees anywhere upstream from us. We don't want to see development take that path. We want to see the development that happens, and it does happen out 44, and it's probably a target area for development. We are a target area for development. We're going to try to do it responsibly with proper detention. We looked at one development. All the material that was going to raise one area was coming out of the Merrimack Basin. So there was actually a net increase in flood storage in that project. And that's what we'd like to see, particularly upstream of us. We don't want to see someone build a levee so that they can have more development. We want them to do it properly and correctly to the point where it doesn't really cause a greater impact downstream, AKA us.
Talk about the Missouri. I mean, do you worry about, Cindy mentioned it's entirely not out of the realm of possibilities that the billions of dollars in development in the Chesterfield Valley could someday be bailed out by tax money.
Well, levees are designed to a certain height, and so there are floods that are always larger than what we designed them to. So levees are typically like our last line of defense. That's once the water's in the river, there's not much you can do. So levees are there to keep water in the river out of areas that you don't want them. There's industry. If you go over to the Illinois side, you have the refineries, you have steel mills, you have communities, you have businesses. Same thing on the Missouri side. That's typically the last line of defense. So normally we try to do, you have NCRS that tries to manage the runoff and cropland. Then we have flood control reservoirs. We try to manage as much runoff into our flood control reservoirs as possible. So if you go upstream of St. Louis, you have Mark Twain Lake. We're trying to manage flood control discharges there. We held back for the flood there. If you go over to the Illinois side, we have like Shelbyville, Carlisle Lake, and they held back critical flood control storage that we're actually now just starting to evacuate. And we knocked off several feet down at Chester, Cape, and the Cairo area that would have easily overtopped those levees down there. So.